There are two possible ways to determine if Peter provided Mark with the information he needed to write the Gospel. First, we can see if there is any external corroboration from historical sources who make this very claim. If Mark wrote his Gospel from the teaching of Peter, someone should have known about it and reported on it. As it turns out, there are a number of historical references to the Gospel of Mark, and to the manner in which it was written. Let's take a look at some of them. Eusebius, the well-respected church historian, wrote that Bishop Papias of Hierapolis repeated the testimony of the old presbyters, disciples of the apostles, who said that Mark wrote his Gospel in Rome, as he scribed the preaching of Peter himself. Papias wrote a 5-volume work entitled Interpretation of the Oracles of the Lord. In this treatise, he quotes someone he identifies as the elder, most likely John the Elder, a man who held considerable authority in Asia. And the elder used to say this: Mark became Peter's interpreter, and wrote accurately all that he remembered, not, indeed, in order, of the things said and done by the Lord. For he had not heard the Lord, nor had followed him, but later on, followed Peter, who used to give teaching, as necessity demanded, but not making, as it were, an arrangement of the Lord's oracles, so that Mark did nothing wrong in thus writing down single points as he remembered them. For to one thing he gave attention, to leave out nothing of what he had heard, and to make no false statements in them. 3 important claims about the second Gospel emerged from this statement. 1. Mark wrote the Gospel that, in Eusebius's day, was identified with this name. 2. Mark was not an eyewitness but obtained his information from Peter. 3. Mark's Gospel lacks order, reflecting the occasional nature of Peter's preaching. The importance of these claims is magnified when we realize that Papias is quoting the Apostle John himself. If Papias is to be trusted, the identification of Mark as the author of the second Gospel goes back to the first generation of Christians. In his book, Against Heresies, Irenaeus reported that Mark penned the Gospel of Mark, as a scribe for Peter, Luke penned the Gospel of Luke from the preaching of Paul, and John penned his own Gospel well after the other two. He also added the following detail. Matthew composed his Gospel among the Hebrews in their own language, while Peter and Paul proclaimed the Gospel in Rome and founded the community. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, handed on his preaching to us in written form. Early Christian apologist, Justin Martyr, wrote Dialogue with Tropho and included this interesting passage. It is said that Jesus changed the name of one of the apostles to Peter, and it is written in his memoirs that he changed the names of others, 2 brothers, the sons of Zebedee, to Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Justin, therefore, identifies a particular gospel as the memoir of Peter, and he says that this memoir describes the sons of Zebedee as the sons of thunder. Only Mark's Gospel describes John and James in this way, so it is reasonable to assume that the Gospel of Mark is the memoir of Peter. Eusebius reported that Clement of Alexandria wrote a book entitled Hypotyposes. In this ancient book, Clement refers to a tradition handed down from the elders from the beginning. And so great a joy of light shone upon the minds of the hearers of Peter, that they were not satisfied with merely a single hearing or with the unwritten teaching of the divine gospel, but with all sorts of entreaties they besought Mark, who was a follower of Peter and whose gospel is extant, to leave behind with them in writing a record of the teaching passed on to them orally, and they did not cease until they had prevailed upon the man, and so became responsible for the scripture for reading in the churches. Eusebius also wrote an additional detail that differs from previous accounts provided by Papias and Irenaeus. Again, in the same books, Clement gives the tradition of the earliest presbyters, as to the order of the Gospels, in the following manner: their Gospels containing the genealogies, he says, were written first. The Gospel according to Mark had this occasion. As Peter had preached the word publicly at Rome, and declared the Gospel by the Spirit, many who were present requested that Mark, who had followed him for a long time and remembered his sayings, should write them out. And having composed the Gospel, he gave it to those who had requested it. When Peter learned of this, he neither directly forbade nor encouraged it. This additional piece of information related to Peter's reaction to Mark's work is important, because it demonstrates that Clement is not simply repeating the information first established by Papias, but seems to have an additional source that provided him with something more and slightly different than Papias. Early Christian theologian and apologist, Tertullian, wrote a book that refuted the theology and authority of Marcion. The book was appropriately called, Against Marcion, and in Book 4 Chapter 5, he described the Gospel of Mark. While that Gospel which Mark published may be affirmed to be Peter's, whose interpreter Mark was. The Muratorian fragment is the oldest known list of New Testament books. Commonly dated to approximately 170 AD, the first line reads, "But he was present among them, and so he put the facts down in his Gospel." This appears to be a reference to Mark's presence at Peter's talks and sermons in Rome, and the fact that he then recorded these messages then became the Gospel of Mark. Eusebius quoted a Gospel commentary written by Origen, an early church father and theologian, who lived 185 to 254 AD, that explains the origin of the Gospels. This commentary also attributes the Gospel of Mark to Peter. In his first book on Matthew's Gospel, Maintaining the Canon of the Church, he testifies that he knows only 4 Gospels, writing as follows: "Among the 4 Gospels, which are the only indisputable ones in the Church of God under heaven, I have learned by tradition, that the first was written by Matthew, who was once a publican, but afterwards an apostle of Jesus Christ, and it was prepared for the converts from Judaism, and published in the Hebrew language. The second is by Mark, who composed it according to the instructions of Peter, who in his Catholic epistle acknowledges him as a son, saying, 'The church, that is at Babylon elected together with you, salutes you,' and so does Marcus, my son, and the third by Luke, their Gospel commended by Paul, and composed for Gentile converts. Last of all that by John." There are 3 Gospel prologues, that appear in many Latin Bibles from antiquity. Known as the Anti-Marcionite prologues, they date to the 4th century or earlier. The prologue for the Gospel of Mark is particularly interesting. Mark recorded, who was called Calobodactylus, meaning stumpy finger, because he had fingers that were too small for the height of the rest of his body. He himself was the interpreter of Peter. After the death of Peter himself, the same man wrote this Gospel in the parts of Italy. Now, it can be argued that Papias' description of Mark's collaboration with Peter in Rome is the earliest description available to us. In fact, skeptics have tried to argue that later church sources are simply parroting Papias, when they connect Mark to Peter. But there is no evidence to suggest that Papias is the sole source of information related to Peter and Mark, particularly when considering the slight variations in the subsequent attributions such as Clement's version. The subtle differences suggest that the claims came from different original sources. In addition, Justin Martyr's tangential reference to the Sons of Thunder strengthens the support for Peter's involvement coming from a source other than Papias, who never makes this connection. In essence, a claim of dependency on Papias lacks specific evidence, and even if this were the case, there is no reason to doubt the accuracy of Papias' original claim in the first place. Christian writers of the 2nd and 3rd centuries confirm that Mark was the author of the second Gospel, and that he depended on Peter for his information. Moreover, no dissenting voice from the early church regarding the authorship of the second Gospel is found. This is surprising, since the tendency in the early church was to associate apostles with the writing of the New Testament books. While we must not uncritically accept everything that early Christian writers say about the origins of the New Testament, we should not reject what they say without good reason. The early and uncontested claim that Mark wrote the second Gospel based on Peter's teaching can be overturned only by rather clear indications to the contrary from the Gospel itself. To assess this internal evidence, we must first identify the Mark intended by Papias and the other early Christian writers. That they refer to the John Mark mentioned in Acts